Alrighty, gang, howdy. Coming at you in the final stretch of our time together here. We are now in the final unit on rhetoric's contemporary challenges, and there are many. And the story that we are tracking continues to be one in the 20th century, now in the 21st, of rhetoric going kind of bigger. Kenneth Burke is an important figure in terms of the expansion of rhetoric from oral, discourse to language in general to the symbolic more broadly. And as we've seen throughout the course of the 20th century, rhetoric attaches itself to technologies and media, to bodies. That's what we're kind of doing this week. To spaces as well, to thinking about many different kinds of mediums and influences, activities, practices, right? Where pressure is coming from, where meaning is being kind of forced, where action is mobilized. This is where we can talk about rhetoric happening. So this first reading is by Joshua Barnett. Rhetoric for Earthly Coexistence, Imagining an Ecocentric Rhetoric is what we're talking about today. And Joshua Barnett had kind of exploded onto the scene a few years back. He came out of the University of Utah, studied with the wonderful scholar Kevin DeLuca, and was for a couple of years at a small school in Minnesota, and wrote like crazy and published, and is now at the top rhetoric program at Penn State. He's been very active, been publishing a lot, and Joshua has emerged in our field at the kind of I think of it as the kind of intersection of two disciplinary conversations that he's kind of bringing together. One is this business of ecology, and the other is this business of care. And each of these has kind of different histories, and he's just kind of coming at a moment and bringing these things together in a certain kind of way that works really well. And so he's done very well for himself the last few years, talking about this business of earthly coexistence and care and the more than human. We'll get into this kind of stuff. So, when I say two different kinds of kind of disciplinary conversations, ecology and care, the environmental movement, we're all familiar with it. That takes us back to the 1960s. It's genuinely thought to have begun with Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, where she's drawing attention to the negative effects of all the chemicals that we're starting to kind of enter into our households, and corporations are using more and more chemicals and sprays and different ingredients. And we're starting to notice effects in terms of water, in terms of land, in terms of sky, right? So it's in the latter part of the 20th century that environmentalism becomes a thing, right? And so in the field of communication, there's a journal called Environmental Communication, and I think there might even be parts of the national organization or the regional organizations in rhetoric, NCA, National Communication Association, I think they have an environmental division associated, right? And I think the regional conferences or the conventions and associations also have environmental, right? So environmental communication is a pretty established kind of sub-discipline within our field. And what it has, long been up to is looking at the kind of agitational efforts of environmental activists, right? So Kevin DeLuca, Barnett's advisor, who I believe is still at University of Utah, published a book back in the maybe mid-90s, and it was called Image Politics. And he was studying back then, now this is going back a bit already, but he was studying the ways that environmental activists were using images, and specifically like the media, to create shocking imagery, right? Like thinking about Greenpeace and the way that it uses its boats, and it creates these kind of shocking, daring stunts, and they're all kind of designed to generate media attention, right? And so DeLuca, going back, was looking at environmental activism as like rhetorical agitation. How can we agitate on behalf of the environment? How can we raise awareness? How can we mobilize? How can we draw attention? How can we change people's perceptions and practices and so on, right? So for decades now, environmental communication has been an established thing. Meanwhile, sort of separately, over the course of the last maybe 15 or somewhat more recently, there was a kind of separate movement in several fields. I think it might have started in philosophy. It's this business of neo-materialism. And sort of separately, but kind of simultaneously, many critical scholars, and this is my own work, got interested in materiality, meaning kind of the physical world. So I study food. I study the food system, and I also study like technology and hard material things, not just media, not just the signals, but the actual like the hard stuff. What's it made out of, right? What are the costs to environment? What are the labor costs? What are the real kind of costs? So there was a bunch of us that got really interested in materiality, and we could talk about like food, and we could talk about bodies, and we could talk about technologies, and we could talk about all kinds of things that aren't necessarily environmental, right? And so you had environmentalists over here who were really just interested in like the environmental activists and so on. And then you had the neo-materialists who started calling themselves ecologists. Now, what is ecology? Well, we tend to think of biology. We tend to think of like waters and streams and frogs and everything's interconnected and systems and how it is that, you know, someone's manure can be someone else's fertilizer, and it's this kind of holistic thing, and everything is connected and interconnected, and one thing benefits another thing, and so it's all about these interrelationships and complex systems and interorganizations and so on, right? So Barnett is bringing kind of these two worlds together, the environmental world, environmentalism world. And by the way, Dr. Bloomfield is also kind of in that world of environmentalism, and she's interested in like public sphere type stuff. So how it is that we argue about environmental stuff and science type stuff in public, and how we make our arguments and so on. All right, so again, Barnett is just kind of bringing together these different strands, the environmental movement, because you get a lot of that in here, right? This like, we need to do better in terms of how we think about the environment and how we treat the environment and how we think about it in terms of our own work, right? But he's also trying to go hard in this like neo-materialist / ecological direction that really wants to just kind of think about physical relationships, right? Like what's connected to what? What affects what? If I do this, what happens, right? If I throw out my trash, gas, starts kicking up into the atmosphere. And then now we have acid rain, and now we have poison crops, and now we have poison food, and now we have poison bodies, right? All of these interconnections. So, and this business of care is a more recent kind of thing, and this is something I think we're all kind of familiar with. It's sort of happened in our own lifetimes. The rhetoric of care, the discourse of care is really kind of like around the pandemic time and a little bit before that. Care, we talk about trauma a lot now, and so we're now in this kind of new space of thinking about care. And so, all right, so Barnett's bringing together environmentalism, which is kind of like care for the land, ecological kind of criticism, which is about what's connected to what, thinking hard about materiality, thinking hard about the real world, right? Real things, material effects and impacts. And then this business of care, which is that we need to be thinking more broadly and more inclusively about our actions and behaviors and what it's leading to and what it's causing, and to think more ethically and more morally and more virtuously about larger and larger systems and phenomenon, right? So that's kind of the big picture here. Now, with all that said, this is not a terribly long piece. He published this in the Journal of Rhetoric and Public Affairs. What year? 21, just a few years ago. He came out with a book that kind of goes much further into all this kind of stuff around this time, and so this is sort of an extension of his book project. Now, he says not too many things in here, so we can go through this kind of quickly. He's just making the argument for an eco-critical rhetoric. Now, others have made similar arguments. We've been talking about ecology in rhetoric. I say we because I've been part of these conversations. The introduction to my book on cookery talks a fair bit about ecology. I've been writing about ecology and talking about ecology. Other people who aren't environmentalists have also been talking about ecology in terms of objects. There was this moment in our field called object-oriented ontology, and it kind of dovetailed with all this stuff. But again, it wasn't really about the environment. It was just about real things, objects, physical things, and how they're connected. So, but Barnett wants to talk about the environment, but he wants to think about it in a very broad ecological sense, right? So if we just briefly pause and think about sort of the environmental movement, the one that we're familiar with, going back to decades. it tends to be about, like the seals that are being clubbed. Like we have these images in our head, like from Greenpeace, right? And it's very like a lot of shocking imagery and what the oil tankers have done with their oil spills and killing animals and all these birds with oil in their wings and so on. And we have a lot of these like really devastating bad images. And so when we think of environmentalism, I tend to, and I think it's born out of this piece here, is we tend to think of environmentalists as very kind of romantically sort of like defending the environment, which is this thing, the environment, right? Where is the environment? This is always a tricky thing, right? Is that like here we are in Las Vegas, we live in the desert. Where is nature? Where is the environment? Where does it begin and end? I think the ecological move, and scholars who I started identifying as more ecological than an environmental, did that largely because this idea of the environment was getting a little bit outdated, right? The environment is always somewhere else, whereas ecology is right here. I'm sitting in a desk, I'm sitting in a chair, the desk is made of wood, everything around me is made out of something. Even as I'm talking, things are happening, energy is flowing, power, everything is about using up resources, and there's materials everywhere. And so everything is ecological. Everything in my office here, all this paper and books and everything came from somewhere, was made, was manufactured, was shipped, right? All of that stuff had an ecological impact in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of fuel that was used to send things here, there, right? Ordering things, delivering things, manufacturing, the labor, the sweat, the calories, the meals that went into the bodies of the laborers who made the things, right? All of this stuff is ecological, even if it's not necessarily environmental, right? So that's why I think ecological is better, because it kind of gets rid of that whole, there's the environment and here's us, right? There's nature and here's culture. Culture bad, nature good. It's too clean, it's too easy, it's too reductive, it doesn't really work. Ecology just asks us to think about what is connected to what and what's affecting what, right? And it asks us also, and he'll push this point pretty hard, is it'll ask us to think reflexively, more and more about ourselves on the chair that I'm sitting on, at the desk I'm sitting at the amount of power that I'm using up. I wonder how many of you have ever thought about, how much energy is being used when I'm scrolling, or how much power is used up by like when something goes viral, right? When it gets 50 million likes or comments or whatever, all that liking is actual energy, right? That takes up resources. And so even these things that seem to be, we think of digital as not material, but it is, right? The digital is powered by water, by oil, all these things that have real effects out there. And he wants us to be thinking about that. So right off the bat, he says basically the points can be boiled down to just a few. First of all, we need to think about an ecological or eco-critical rhetoric. Why? Because the earth is on fire. First of all, subpoint, we can't get away from that fire. Even as scholars, no one can get away from the earth, right? No matter what we do, no matter where we go, we are implicated in the transformations and the destruction and the disasters, his language, like of the planet. And if you've been alive at any point in the last 7 or 8 years, you know what the heck we're talking about at this point, because it's really starting to land, right? Winter fires in Colorado. There was like a firestorm in Colorado a few years ago. We got fires everywhere. It's getting really, really wild, right? So he's like, we need to be thinking more and more about ecological implications all the time. All right, so we need to think about eco-critical rhetoric because the world's on fire, subpoint, and we can't get away from that, right? Next point that he wants to make is, where is it? Let me just jump to here's what eco-critical rhetoric is. Yeah, page 367, bottom paragraph. He's talking about, toward the top of that page, he's talking about anthropocentric and ecocentric, right? So anthro is like human. Anthropocentric means human-centric. And ecocentric is more, my understanding is home, right? So it's more about like what's connected to what in terms of our our immediate kind of neighborhood, right? Like I got houses all around me here. I've got neighbors. I've got, right? Everyone's connected. So eco is more about us, whereas anthro is more about like me, right? It's like singular. The human versus the eco, which is beyond the human, right? So he's saying it's not even so much about what we study, it's how we study. It's thinking about what matters. It's thinking about what we choose to focus on. It's also how we conduct ourselves as we're doing it here. So at the bottom of 367, he says, an ecocentric, there's like three kind of dimensions to an eco-critical rhetoric or an ecocentric rhetoric. It will be animated and suffused by the conviction that earthly coexistence is our most pressing task. So earthly coexistence is like everything that's alive on this planet must figure out a way to kind of coexist in peace and in I don't want to use the word harmony, but in some kind of balance. Otherwise, we are in big trouble, basically, right? It will embrace, what will this ecocentric rhetoric do? Number one, it will embrace a capacious conception of rhetoric. So keep that in mind, a capacious conception of rhetoric, fine. Second, it will understand democracy as a more than human endeavor, okay. And third, finally, an ecocentric rhetoric will attune to the material costs and ecological consequences of rhetorical labor. So basically, wants to talk about three things. This notion that eco-critical rhetoric requires a very big notion of rhetoric. Number two, that democracy also needs us to think about beyond the human, essentially. And then third is that we need to be thinking reflexively all the time, okay? Now, we could go pretty deep into the issues and the implications and the complications of what he's talking about here. But when he's moving into this first section, imagining an ecocentric rhetoric. Now, this is big stuff, right? Because he's saying we need to think about a capacious, a large notion of rhetoric. Well, we've already been entertaining bigger and bigger and bigger notions of rhetoric throughout this 20th century, throughout the last several weeks of readings here. And so, like, how big do we want to get? And I think at one point, I don't know if I can find it exactly, but at one point he even uses the word planetary. This is actually the bottom of 370. One question is whether we can become capable of receiving signals disseminated by plants and animals, by ecological events and planetary processes, right? And so he's thinking about rhetoric in a almost cosmic sense, in the largest kind of planetary ecological sense, right? And it's like, wait, rhetoric is that big? It's hard to kind of grasp, right? But that's what he's talking about, because everything, ozone, right? Like everything that's interconnected, that affects climate, that affects how we live, the conditions of our lives, is fair game here. So he wants us to try to embrace that. Now, on 369, one way we can do that, right? Like, how do I listen to a termite? How do I listen to a cockroach? Why do I care what a beetle has to say? Because he's essentially saying we need to listen to he uses the phrase more than human, which to me tips me off that we're in the realm of environmentalism, because I tend to think of the environmentalist scholars as nature is better, humans are worse, right? Like human culture's over here and it does all this damage. And so bugs and rocks and trees and shrubs and all that wonderful stuff, that's better than, so more than human. I'm a little snarky about this. I noticed this tendency in the field a few years back to say anything that wasn't human was more than human. When I write it, I say extra human, just sort of like past the human or beyond or whatever, but not better necessarily. It's just extra, right? In any case, this business of we want to be trying to think about, because again, if we're thinking about, go back historically, right? Go back to my video on Burke's definition of man essay, where I'm talking about rotten with perfection, this idea of the frontier, right? Now, moving into the frontier in the 19th century and all the damage that was done and all the war and violence and killing and, felling of trees and killing of buffalo and all the rest of it, was largely done under the sign of manifest destiny, under the sign of the great American experiment, right? And so there was these images, these symbols, these fantasies, this rhetoric that was pulling us out there, right? So you could say that all of the environmental destruction and chaos that happened in this country, in the West and whatever, was kind of driven by rhetoric, driven by language, driven by dreams and fantasies of the fertile land and the virgin territories. And so you could talk about the way, and environmental scholars have done all this, the ways that we sort of feminize and sexualize the land and think about it as a woman that's begging us to take it and to claim it and so on, right? All of this kind of stuff, like I'm on his side here, right? Is like the rhetoric and language is woven into our experiences with the physical world, right? We create these narratives and these stories that kind of like, lurch us out into physical space under whatever kind of scheme or project or narrative that we're following, and we go do things, and there are real material consequences, right? So we want to be thinking about that in the broadest possible sense, and we want to try to listen to and understand and respect the existence, the earthly coexistence of non-human entities like trees and like waterways and like meadows and, creatures of all kinds, right? Now, but it's hard because, as he says at one point, a few more pages, I think, he talks about bird song and he talks about different ways that the nature can speak, right? And can we hear it? Can we hear the sounds of nature crying or screaming or yelling or laughing or whatever? And what does that sound like? This is an ongoing question for those who are interested in environmental communication, how it is that the human and the non-human, or the more than human or the extra human, can actually kind of communicate. And a lot of environmental communication is really about that question of how can we better understand and better collaborate with the more than human, right? All right, let me try to start wrapping up here. So basically, on 371, in the middle paragraph at the top, it says, we owe it to the earth to try to attune into those signals that we can perceive with our senses, which we can see, hear, smell, taste, or feel, and those that we can detect by other means. We want to try to listen. I've even read stuff about what if we could make what if we could give rights, like legal rights to water, because increasingly, as time goes by, water becomes more precious, more rare, more scarce. There's already all kinds of conflicts and anxieties about major waterways in Asia. One that goes, I wrote about it a couple years back. It goes from China down into India, this massive river. And, talk about international conflict, right? When so many people rely on a massive river that starts to disappear, or it gets dammed by the Chinese government, hundreds of miles upstream kind of thing, right? So this is consequential stuff, and it's worth us because, as he said, we can't get away from this stuff. It finds us. All of the effects of our ecological kind of behaviors, no matter what, it will find us, right? There's a cost, there's a toll. Nature holds the receipts kind of idea. So we owe it to ourselves and to the earth to try to listen and try to account for when we're building something. What kind of damage are we going to do? What are going to be the, not just financial costs, but the ecological costs, right? And is it a wise thing to do? I'm morbidly curious about what's going to be happening in Florida over the next decade, right? Because Florida is going to get, it always has been ravaged by storms and hurricanes and the whole bit. And of course, the insurance industry has had to pay out and pay out and pay out. So I imagine insurance premiums for homeownership in Florida are pretty crazy, right? Well, they're only going to just go up and up and up because insurance companies have to keep forking over so much, right? At a certain point, and I think this is already happening, insurance companies are saying, we're out of the Florida home insurance business. It's too costly, right? What happens when insurance companies no longer will even get into that game because the storms are so bad? This is when nature speaks, and we need to listen to these kinds of things. We can ignore climate change all we want until it hits our pocketbooks, until our insurance rates are so crazy that we can't afford not to act. You know what I mean? In any case, he's trying to talk about this stuff, right? Nature's talking to us, right? We are doing things and the consequences are coming back to us, and we got to be listening. We got to be attentive. Otherwise, we are toast. So he gives us a few little hints on how to do this. He talks about relationality on page, this is the first thing he gets to in this section, relationality is back a few pages. Yeah, 369, he talks about relationality, this business of what's connected to what. Then a few more pages over, he talks about form, which is also good, right? It's like, let's think about form. And that kicks in on 373. So if we're thinking about the form of things, then we're thinking about materiality, right? What is the form of, he talks about 373, he says, considering form goads us to reflect upon the ecological conditions necessary for the creation, performance, and dissemination of rhetorics, but it also invites us to account for the materiality of rhetorics, right? So when we think about the form of a message, we have to think about the materials that went into disseminating a message, and that gets us thinking ecologically. He also urges us to think about what's left out. Absences, elisions, erasures matter, right? Who is left out? Who is ignored? Who is assumed not to matter? Or what? Not just who, but what? You know, what species, what spaces, what living realities are ignored? Let me then quickly wrap up. That's pretty much what it is. And now, as I was reading through this, I was like, my goodness, he's got a lot of like, we must. Boy, you sure are preachy here, Joshua. And then he even writes this little thing at the end saying, hey, by the way, sorry about all those we must. I just care a lot, and I'm trying to be really, really hopeful. And he's on to something obviously very important here, which is, and the last thing that he ends on is like, we got to be thinking about our own practices as scholars. We got to be thinking about when we order a book, the ecological costs of that thing. It's always tricky, right? Because there's trade-offs. We're now learning that electric cars maybe weren't better necessarily than gas-powered cars, because even electricity has to come from somewhere, right? It comes from reusable renewable resources, and it's not that clean, and it's a big hassle, and right? And so there's always trade-offs. There's like few perfect answers here, but we owe it to ourselves and to our earthly coexistence co-inhabitants to try to do better, to try to think more about our impact and our choices and so on. All right, so there you go. There's a big, broad look at rhetoric as potentially anything that is affected by our discourses, by our symbol systems, by our languages, right? These innocent living beings and creatures and forests and the Amazon rainforest, and everything's been touched by all of our rhetorics of progress and industry and free market, this and that and that. So Barnett is saying, hey, maybe we should be thinking about the impacts, and maybe we should be thinking about what goes into our thought processes, and think a little harder about the consequences of our behavior, down to every little choice we make, even in our professional lives and so on, right? So much appreciated, Joshua. Thank you for stating things so, starkly and matter-of-factly. And so there you go. So the next reading we're going to be doing on bodies and spaces is more on bodies, right? So I wanted to try to cover like the big, broad spatial stuff, but also thinking about bodies themselves, and then we could try to think about the relations, all right? So hope that's working for you, and peace be to you all, and we'll talk more soon.